I don't want to just get through parenting. We shouldn't be wanting to get through parenting for our kids. We should be wanting to make it an amazing experience for everyone.
Lack of certainty and control is huge.
The game isn't that stacked against us. Hard work and good ethics can get you somewhere.
There's definitely a need for a safe space for people to just talk about this stuff without a doubt.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I'm David Chambers, your host. And today we have a absolute wonderful episode because I'm talking to a friend, someone I've known for a long time. And we really get into some wonderful topics of his life. And I think things that men don't talk about enough, and there's not been, I haven't seen talks about enough. He talks about his journey from living on a council estate to becoming a C-suite executive, right? And, me and him are around the same age. And Ranjit, who I commonly known as Frank throughout the episode, who will explain why. And he talks about that journey for himself, right? Of going from really having very little and having very little prospects, and the people around him viewing that, the best prospects he could have was leaving school and working in a factory or becoming a window cleaner, to really working for some of the biggest companies in the country, and being, a C-suite executive. But he also talks about a journey that most men don't really get into, which is actually the journey of IVF and how it was for him and how it affected his life and affected his career and some of the job choices that he's made afterwards. He will get into the details of, what he does now and how, that IVF journey has affected him, and how self-awareness and self-consciousness, it's not, when I say self-consciousness, not being self-conscious, but deepening his self-consciousness has really helped him along that path to being a better father and showing up in better ways for his little kids, as well as helping other people show up as better parents. And it's a fascinating conversation because we really do get across a lot of different topics, and we do laugh, but it's some really serious bits and pieces in there, and a lot of knowledge for you, especially if you are, thinking about parenting. It's especially a good episode if you're thinking about becoming parents, and also a really important episode if you are going through IVF or, potentially having to go through the route of IVF. So if you know someone who, that situation is true for, someone who's about to be a parent, or someone who's going through IVF now, or someone who's at a career point where they're thinking about making a change, getting out of the C-suite life, then this is a really great episode to send them over. So really do, spread the love by sending them this episode and helping them along their journey and helping them gain some more wisdom. But without further ado, I'll let you get into the episode. So people, I'm back with an episode that, I've been trying to cook up for a little while. It's not that often, actually, I get to bring in people on the podcast who I've known in a capacity before podcasting through friendship and through many years. And today I'm joined by Ranjit, a friend of mine, a man who does some really beautiful and interesting work. How are you doing, Ranj?
I'm good. Lovely to speak to you, finally.
It's really weird for me to call him Ranj because normally I'm used to call him Frank. So if I slip into Frank, people, that's kind of why, because for many years I've known him as Frank.
Do we need to close off why that is, or are we just going to leave people hanging?
I think we'll leave him hanging for a while.
Okay. I'll cover it, just so they don't have to hang on to it for the whole episode.
So yeah, tell the listeners, like, what is it, the work that you do now?
Yeah, sure. So after, quite a varied journey, but, went through the corporate world ultimately, from kind of growing up on a council estate with very limited money really, and various other things. I now work with parents. I'm a dad to twins. We had quite a journey getting to them. It was about 4.5 years of IVF. When the twins arrived, it was amazing because we've been waiting for them for a long time, but it was also absolutely bananas. And I just remember thinking, why did no one tell me this was what it was going to be like? Because, I just had lots of conversations with people about what parenting was going to be like. I wanted to be well prepared. I wanted to be the best dad that I could be. Me and my wife were on the same page. We wanted to create a great household for them, a great environment. And when they arrived, it was just beyond anything I can, that it's hard to describe. It's beyond anything that I've certainly been through, and I've pushed myself hard my entire life. So, I decided after a variety of different things, trying out different ways of kind of creating that great environment for them, that I wanted to actually combine my passion for coaching, with helping parents, because it's so important, right? It's important that we enjoy our experience of parenting. You don't get to do it again. You don't get to do it twice. Even if you have more kids, that child that's in front of you, you could just get to parent once. And obviously has a huge impact on them. Like, how much of our lives are determined by the impact that our parents have on us, for better or for worse. And so for me, it's just like, it's an amazing way to combine what I'm trying to work on in myself with helping others who are really in need, because this is a massive unserved need in the world, because people don't talk about the challenges of parenting or what they're going through. And obviously it has an impact on their kids, which is beautiful. I can't think of a better legacy than knowing that I've in some way, shape or form helped families to have better relationships with each other, and for their kids to grow up, without some of the things that we maybe had to go through.
Yeah. And I guess for the listeners to understand, it's also that, over the last, 6 months to year, I've regularly caught up with Frank to, part of, the journey that I'm entering into in the future, not too sure when that future is going to be, in a not too distant future, I imagine, of having children. And he's been one of the people I've gone to talk to about it, and, the journey in and what it feels like. Because, we'll probably talk about this later in the episode. As men, we don't really talk about how it is for us to have children. There's a big kind of hole. I remember talking to a guy called Cam Fraser, actually, on the podcast probably last year. And we had similar conversation around men and parenting, right? Because there's just this massive gap for a lot of us men. We just it just arrives, doesn't it? They just kind of pop out and you go, oh shit, I'm a parent now. I got to look after these little things. At least women, and I've talked to women about this, as quite a few of them have said that there's that process of like, oh, it's growing inside of me. Like, it's coming along. Oh, I'm getting bigger. I can feel it. There's this 9-month period of, or at least, minimum of kind of, well, it's 9 months, but there's a period of feeling that there's something changing and growing. Whereas for a man, we're kind of an observer of that process, and it only becomes like a real reality until they pop their little heads out, whichever hole they come out of, usually, depending, C-section or not. I was a C-section baby, so I didn't come out the conventional route. But I think I'd love to start with your career path, because, we met many years ago. And like you said, you similar to myself, growing up on a council estate. And I know that, when you kind of start to shift your career, you were very high up in the tech world, because we used to have a lot of conversations about the ills of technology and technology projects and the management of them. So I'd love to hear about kind of, where you started out and your career path through that, and some of the things you kind of learn about yourself, and even maybe about the world that you kind of started off in, and what you learn about the world that you ended up in.
Yeah, it's huge, actually. And again, as you have kids, and I know you're doing the same because this is what we talk about, you reflect on your life and you're like, who have I, like, how have I changed? What shit do I not want to pass on to my kids? What experiences do I not want them to have to go through that I went through? And what things do I want to pass on to my kids? And what things do I want them to have access to, or to go through that, I did or would have liked to? And so that's a huge part of certainly the journey that we had in preparing for being parents. And again, we'll talk about that a bit more later on, because it's part of what I do. But Yeah, I mean, I grew up single parent family from about 18 months, 2 years old. So my mum and dad split. I still saw my dad all kind of once a week. And, I had a decent relationship with him. But, he was in and out of my life on a, fairly regular basis. And I spent all my time with my mum. We're on benefits. We lived in a council house. It was a pretty nice area, to be honest. I'm not going to lie. It's not like it was this in a London tower block, right, in East London, but it was not. If you live there, I've been there recently. It's quite nice now, but, certainly expensive to live, right? But, in comparison to the 80s, right, it was where we lived wasn't too bad. But nevertheless, I had a lot of the limitations. And my family take the piss out of my accent now because I spent so long in corporate environments. The way I speak's totally changed, right? But yeah, so I grew up. Another really interesting fact is I had a really religious upbringing. I'm not sure you knew this actually, but you definitely wouldn't know it from your exposure to me. But I was brought up a Jehovah's Witness, which is quite a strict religion.
Yeah.
So a lot of, there was some negatives to that. I didn't get access to certain things that I might have done otherwise. I couldn't play team sports. That's why I'm not particularly good at or interested in any particular team sports. When you talk to me about football, my eyes kind of glaze over. And obviously there were other things, no birthdays, no Christmas, that kind of thing. But actually it also gave me access to a lot of things and exposure to a lot of things in the world that I wouldn't have got if I'd just been in a single parent family on a council estate, because it was a very different community within the religion. And also it taught me how to study. So, I'm not convinced I'm that bright, but I do know I have discipline. I know how to study. And a lot of that came from the religion because they taught you to study. And I went to meetings 3 times a week where they would ask you questions about what you'd read and stuff. Wow. So that was from like a really young age. And so, I took a lot away from that was positive, but ultimately kind of decided around 15, 16 that I wanted to check out. But my mum had very little ambition for me. Her main priority was that I stayed in the religion. She wanted me to be a window cleaner. My stepmom told me to leave leave school when I was 15 to go work in a factory making hinges, which was what I was doing over the summer. And I think I got my drive partly from what I got exposure to, partly through the religion, partly through living in a bit of a mixed area, albeit on a council estate, where I could see what middle class people's lives look like. But also, my sister was pretty successful. She left home at 18, went and got a job, and was just kind of washing away through her career. She's 13 years older than me, so obviously by this point she'd had a decent career. So there was a bit of that, but I never really sure where I got the drive from. The funny thing is, the reason I went to university, and this is, you'll probably start to realize why people call me Frank, if you've seen the film Old School, is I just wanted to carry on partying. I partied a lot, right? When I was in my teens, and I thought uni sounds great. They're like, I'm going to go somewhere I can carry on learning and party. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't work shy. I've been working since I was 13, 14, right? Way before I should have been. But I just thought seems like a great balance, and I can get a job while I'm there and do that on the weekends or whatever. So I went to uni to do that. And then something weird happened. I got to uni, and again, being lifted up and taken out of that environment that I was used to and the people I was surrounded by normally, and being surrounded by a load of people who had worked really hard to go to uni and really cared about their education and what they were doing. And I was like, I just felt bad that I was treating it so casually. So I started to take it seriously, a little bit more seriously. I was still partying, still focusing a lot on, the things that I enjoyed doing, exercise, that kind of thing. But I just started taking the education side a bit more seriously. And then it turns out, because of the discipline and the skills that I developed when I was younger at studying, I was pretty good at it. So I had a good run through uni, got a good degree, came out the other side. And then, I did some traveling, much like you did a little bit later, around Southeast Asia and Australia, New Zealand, that kind of thing. And then came back and got a job locally to where I'd grown up, and then decided I wanted to move to London. So I'd always been looking at consultancy work because they paid well, honestly, nothing particularly more sophisticated than that. I was still very much in that mindset that I'd grown up with, of like, money is the most important thing. We'd never had any. It was stopped us doing things. And so that's what I was focused on. And so looking at consultancy, started working for a big consultancy, moved to London, immediately got assigned to a project outside of London, where I spent the next 3.5 years. So it's like the typical consultancy journey. But, one of the things consultancies give you is a lot of exposure. They help you They help you grow really quickly. We always say I wouldn't want to stay at consultancy necessarily, although that's the work I'm doing now, ironically, as well. But they say it's a great place to start your career because you get very quick exposure to lots of different things. So worked there for about 4.5 years, went on to Thomson Reuters, British Telecom, Clark Shoes, and then ultimately into the C-suite when I was about 35 at an energy company. So I progressed a lot. I moved around a lot even when I moved out of consultancy, I was always in kind of almost like an internal consultancy capacity, doing lots of different things. And, you know, the main thing about that journey really is the people I was surrounded by. Like, I'm just so grateful when I look back on my life every time I moved from one environment to another, from one company to another, and went up a little bit in the ladder. It wasn't ever the money that really made a difference. It was always just the people I was surrounded by, and they pushed me and they forced me to focus on myself and talk about my weaknesses and just, I guess, instilled a sense of wanting to develop myself, right? And move myself forward that started slowly to decouple itself from money. So that's kind of where I got to by the end of my career. I was in the C-suite at this big energy company, and that's where the twins arrived. We talk a bit more about the dynamics of that in a minute. But probably the final thing is, you know, going back to the point around money, because it's so important. When I got to 30, I did Landmark Forum, which I know you're well aware of. And that was like a massive turning point in my life. It was my first real exposure to coaching, being coached directly. And it made me realize that all the money in the world wasn't going to make that much of a difference to my parents. It was who I told myself I was trying to earn money for, to improve their quality of life. They didn't care by that point. They were pretty happy, to be honest. And I realized that I was getting more money, but it wasn't really making me any happier. Like all the things that I was worrying about and thinking about had nothing to do with money. And so I really started at that point to focus on myself and think about myself and how I was going to develop myself and how I was going to get what I wanted out of life instead of chasing this thing, which was like a limitation that I brought with me from when I was a kid in the environment that I'd grown up in. And so that had a massive impact on my 30s. And that's actually really where my career took off. During that period was when I just flipped out, stopped chasing money, and just started focusing on what do I enjoy doing? What am I good at? How can I improve myself? How can I add value? And like, once I did that, like things they just accelerated so much.
Beautiful. And all these years we've known each other, I've never fully known the journey that you had. The thing that jumped to my mind, who introduced you to Landmark Forum?
Ritesh.
Was it? Yeah. Because
our mutual friend.
Yeah, we got a mutual friend, but we all did the Landmark Forum, right? Which is, phenomenal. I still recommend this to people, actually, Landmark Forum. Landmark in general, right? And it started with, with AJ, right? He was the first of our friends to go, and then he told me, and obviously Ritesh and so forth. And there's like a path of easily maybe 8 people I know that come from that kind of first seed that went to the Landmark Forum, and it changed their lives. But I think some of the things that really stuck out to me there was growing up Jehovah's Witness is like, I have some, not full experience, but my mum, I grew up in Pentecostal church, and some of my mum's friends were Jehovah's Witness, and there's a lot of strict rules and regulations of what you can do and can't do. And is it Jehovah's Witness you don't take blood transfusions? Was it 7 Days Adventist?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. As
well. Yeah. So, but it's interesting that out of all that, you talked about seeing the middle classes, right? Because this is something I kind of experienced as well in my life, where growing up around people who never thought that they could really amount to anything, right? I definitely remember being around people, being a young man, kind of 7, 8 years old, and even into my teens, and just everyone around you is kind of limited. They're limited. They don't believe that they can rise up above a certain point. For me, I definitely saw it was people didn't believe, they believed that everything was stacked against them because they were black, so they had no chance. And that might be church on a Sunday for me, and maybe some family and some of my mum's friends. And then my dad put me into a private school when I was 8 years old. So then I would go into this private school every week, which for the first couple of years was one of the most horrible experiences of my life, because I was dyslexic, I was well behind. It was very, very difficult. And I'd be with people who were just like, no one was super wealthy. Everyone was very working class, which is really interesting. The private school I went to was a very small school. They only had one class per year of like 15, 16 students. But everyone in the class, like you would speak to them, and it's like one of the guys, his dad was a double glazing salesman, basically. And he had made it big in the 80s when everyone started buying double glazing, set up his own company and like bought a big house in Chigwell, which is like super cliche because it's around the time of only Birds of a Feather. So it was like literally that's where it was. And that everyone in Birds of a Feather was like super dodgy and into dodgy business. But like another guy whose dad had set up a butcher. And now he owned like 10 butchers across East London when I was like 13. So I was around these people who were working class, but yet they'd made money and they'd made something in their life. And what I saw was like, hard work can get you somewhere, you know? Like the game isn't that stacked against us. Like hard work and good ethics can get you somewhere. And it sounds like for you, it was like you got that message, you know, indoctrinated through, you know, going to Jehovah's Witness meetings, being asked, like studying, being asked about it. You know, it's almost like you were constantly in the process of a comprehension test. You know, do you remember there's a school, you have to read something and then there'd all be all those questions about what did you learn? What do you think about this thing? But actually it creates a lot of like thinking around critical thinking, understanding of it, which are incredibly useful when we get into, just get into adult life, but particularly like corporate environments where that's what we need to do is think critically about situations.
Yeah, 100%. And it is, like you say, understanding that while things might be stacked against you, they're not possible and they're not beyond the wit of a normal human being if you just put time and energy into it. And you know, I reflect a lot on my cousins who are really, really smart, crazy smart, but they've had a different journey to me, and actually I think they might be happier, so you know, kudos to them, right? But you know, again, they didn't have that, and there is a difference that is of that in terms of the way that they look at things, I think. And I see that around my old friends, the people I used to hang around with, schools, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely, I totally agree with what you're saying. The most important thing I think that we can do is show people what is possible, right? You know, and I think that's why things like podcasts are taking off, right? It's because people get access to other people's journeys, hearing these stories, and they're like, oh, I can do that. You know, like literally my stepmom's view was you should go and get a job in a factory at 15, drop out of school, and like that's going to be your life. Like, and that's not, I'm not bitter at her for saying that. That's just like, that's what she thought was normal. And I was like, that's not normal. You know, I know that doesn't have to be normal. That doesn't have to be the way that life plays out for me. So yeah, it's 100% agree with you.
And there's some similarity as well, because I obviously I've got a sister, and my sister is 9 years older than me, and she's now like, I don't know how much I can say, but she's pretty high up in the world of ASOS. And you quite regularly, there was a point where friends of mine would send me pictures of magazines and be like, David, is this your sister? I'm like, yeah. So she's talking about this fashion stuff. I was like, yeah, that's what she does. And she's been in that for a long time. And I feel like it does create like a beautiful, I'm going to call it a glass ceiling, but it's a very high glass ceiling, like, because you see someone who raised in the same home as you or looks like you, has the same parents as you, and you see them making shit happen in their life, and you kind of look at yourself and go, well, fuck, I could do that too. You know, it's almost like the perfect role model, you know, someone's blazing that trail ahead of you, making stuff happen, and you can go, oh, well, there's actually very little difference between us. And you might even secretly be thinking, I'm smarter than they are, actually. Because they're your sibling.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I 100% agree. My sister did that. My brother did it too, because, you know, they both own their own homes. They like have money. They could fill up a tank of fuel in one go. Like, that blew my mind that you would do that. Yeah. So, you know, just seeing that, they were a lot older than me. So I always had a huge amount of respect and was a bit in awe when I was younger at what they were doing, but it opened that door for me between that, what I'd seen with the witnesses, the skills I developed, and, you know, knowing that, I guess bluntly, I was like, I can still party and I can do pretty well at school. So that's a good combination for me to keep going on, right? And, you know, that partying thing didn't really go away. It's around the Landmark Forum time where it's just like, okay, like, if money's not important, then what else do I need to look at in my life that might not be important? And, you know, that took me on a bit of a journey. Not to say I don't enjoy partying. I mean, once you're a parent, you forget about that anyway. But it's definitely toned down. I think the world of Frank the Tank is definitely in the past. Unfortunately, if we can put him to bed and give him a kiss on the forehead and leave him.
Oh, we had some good nights out. I remember a lovely time in Thailand, in particular.
Yes, yeah.
I won't say any more details about that, people. Some things just need to be memories.
Best left unsaid, yeah.
But so there came a point in your career, right? What I'm really hearing is there came a point in your career where it's like, okay, this isn't for me anymore. This C-suite life is no longer for me. What was that like? What was that decision like for you?
Yeah, it was hard. So, and I'll rewind a bit. So I think I'd known that I'd always hoped, and maybe known is the right word actually, that I wanted to get to a senior level, and I got to that level. And a few things happened. So first of all, I'd always known that I probably wanted to do something different from around the age of 45. But let's say the last third of my career, if that was the first 2/3 of my career, my last third of my career, I wanted to do something different. And that's not about seniority or job title. I just felt like I wanted to do something different, do something a bit more experimental, maybe go back, get a degree, a second degree or whatever. Just do something different because I had worked my ass off. A 50-hour week is a quiet week for me, always has been. And, so quite often a lot more than that. And I just knew that I just kind of wanted to change things up. So I kind of knew that was coming. So in the back of my mind, I hadn't really done detailed thinking about that, but I just kind of knew that decision point was coming. I loved the work that I did, but it did take a toll. I was stressed. I was short-tempered. My wife didn't get the best from me that I wanted her to get. All the normal things that we all go through when we have stressful jobs and we're trying to push our careers. And so I didn't feel like I'd really got a handle on that. And I suppose that was the important thing because I knew, one of the consequences of me and my wife having 4.5 years for the kids to arrive was we got to talk about it a lot and we got to think about it a lot. It's not like we just started trying, she got pregnant and we're like, oh shit, like we're in delivery mode. Like we actually had loads of time to talk about, and these are some of the key things I try to get people to think about is what kind of parent do you want to be? Like what experience of parenting do you want to have? Like who do you then need to be? Because the chances are the things you've just described aren't going to happen naturally. Like, I'm super impatient person. I'd learned to manage that somewhat through my career because being an impatient leader is not great. But I knew that I wasn't good at managing that so well when I was at home. And I also knew if I'm sleep deprived, which is basically a constant, companion when you're a parent, then it was going to be harder. If I was feeling stressed out because I had too many conflicting priorities, which again, constant companion when you're a parent, it was going to be harder. So that's just one element of my personality. The scarcity mindset, that money thing is, I struggle to have an abundance mindset. I have to work really hard at it. And I don't want to pass it on to my kids because I know how important. It's one of the things when we talk about private schools. When I joined that consultancy, there was an intake group of 70 odd people, 75 people, I think. Of that, there were like 4 of us that didn't go to private school. Wow. And one of the biggest differences I saw in those people is they had some version of abundance mindset, call it confidence, call it entitlement, call it whatever you want. But the reality was it was just abundance mindset. And so I didn't want to pass my kind of scarcity mindset onto my kids. So these are just 2 things, like dealing with impatience, dealing with scarcity mindset that I wanted to kind of focus on and figure out how not to pass on to my kids. And, the question becomes, how is my career helping me to do that? How is my role helping me to do that? And that kind of thing. I wouldn't say I knew that I wanted to leave. And obviously, the kids arrived. So the kids arrived during COVID. So 2020, they were born in the summer. And they arrived during COVID. And it just so happened we're in the process of selling a business to private equity, which is a really tough gig. Like it's busy, it's intense. This is the world of mergers and acquisitions. Like it's tough. It's like investment banking. It's like consulting, long hours, hard work, etc. I'd never done that before. I was leading a big chunk of the transaction. So my team were depending on me. They'd never done it before. The whole business was not for profit. So it wasn't really set up to be sold. So it was just complicated. It was hard work. It was, maybe not from an hour's perspective. It probably wasn't a lot more than what I just said earlier. But it was just very intense, a lot of pressure. And that's when the twins chose to arrive. So from a career perspective, it was just like the worst possible time. And I had a month of paternity leave, which I thought would be loads. I thought a month, like men only get 2 weeks, a month would be loads, right? And there's a few reasons that was a stupid thing to think. Like one, and I've come to realize this, like men need a lot longer. And, you know, if you've got the opportunity to take shared parental leave or whatever, please, for the love of God, do. You need it. You're born with your kids. You need that time to do some of the work that I'm talking about, like thinking about yourself and who you're going to be as a parent. But more than ever, you need it to maintain a relationship with your spouse as well, because they're going to be struggling with it on their own if you're not there. So that's just like a bit of a plea for people to consider this, because men are struggling to take this leave. But I took a month, and my wife runs her own business. So what we hadn't thought about is Ranjit's having a month. She was working in the hospital the day after she gave birth on her own business, and she had no leave. So actually, compared to most people, I had a month off, Laura had nothing, and that was our life. And we had twins. So twins is hard work. It's harder than one baby. You know, I don't blag on about how much harder it is, but it is. And the reality is, you know, they didn't sleep. So again, what we didn't realize with twins is for the first 2 weeks or so, they wake up and need to be fed every 90 minutes, night and day. So, and with twins, again, we could never crack how one person could feed both of them. So we would both be waking up every 90 minutes. Laura would be having to do other stuff. So she'd be getting even less sleep. So, you know, this is just like some crazy sleep cycle. It's doing all kinds of things to how you feel. And then gradually over time, I think by the time I got back to work after a month, they were maybe down to waking up 2 or 3 times a night. And again, we'd both largely have to wake up to deal with that because they need feeding. So I was back at work on like 4 or 5 hours sleep, dealing with this massive, you know, project team that needed me, you know, lots of seniors, lots of stakeholders that needed a lot of attention. And it was hard work. I wouldn't say it was impossible, but it was hard work. And so we got the project done. We got it done. But I think I got to the end of it as 9 months later, and the kids were 9 months. Things were calming down a little bit, but it is still crazy. Like the thing, and one of the things no one ever talks about is how much children change. So they talk about a high level, but what I mean is the amount that their sleep patterns change, the amount that their feeding patterns change, what they need from you changes. And me and Laura used to joke in that first year and a half, really, just as you think you've nailed it and you're like, oh my God, I feel like a human being again. It feels like I've got some control of the situation. They change. Like you can guarantee the day that you have that feeling, that day that their nap will change, their feeding patterns will change, whatever. So I got to the end of that period of delivering that program and just thought, maybe it's time for me to take a bit of time out and think a bit more about what I want to do. And the final thing that kind of played into that decision was Laura's business. So she was really struggling to run it while I was working a kind of normal job. And I just thought, she's built that over 7 years, and I didn't want her to have to give it up, you know, because in theory, it should have been easier for me to take a break and go back and get a corporate job than for her to close down a business and start it back up again, right? And so, you know, lots of things about the decision that didn't make sense, you know, kind of financially and what have you, but actually just felt like the right thing to do for me, given everything else that was going on. So that kind of led me to that position. And I guess it does ultimately boil down to me asking myself, do I think I can be the dad that I want to be with things as they are at the minute? And the answer was no. And therefore something had to change. And it just so happened that for me, you know, again, this isn't the right answer for everyone. That meant, you know, leaving that role. You know, the C-suite life, yeah, it has its challenges. You know, having been kind of self-employed, starting my own businesses for the past 18 months, that certainly has its own challenges as well. So, you know, I wouldn't say I miss it, but I certainly, you know, there are positives to it as well.
Wow. Wow. It's a big, a lot of upheaval in a short space of time, right? And this is something, you know, even me me and also as two people who run our own businesses, what really landed when you were like, oh yeah, so she was working, you know, the day after delivery. I just had this vision in my head of like, oh my God, that's Orsa. She's literally going to be like, okay, they're out now. I need to send this email. I need to send an email and do this thing. And I'd be like, also, maybe you should take some time out. Like, but that's like intense, right? Because you're going for the company is being sold. There's a huge demand on because often we just think of work as like time, right? And I think when you're in I'm going to come out and say this. I think the roles I've generally been in my career, in my tech career, were very easy, right? I just rocked up and gave some effort during the time and did a really good job, right? That was my career for me, right? And obviously I always stayed at a certain level because I contracted and so forth. But what I've noticed now with coaching is when I'm coaching, the level of intensity in that time is so much higher and I'm far more drained, right? So what I'm hearing from you is like during that period there where you were working, you had massive intensity at work. You've got huge intensity at home because there's no sleep. You've got twins that have just arrived. They've just come out. They still smell fresh, that baby smell from the hospital, you know. And the twins part is really, you know, some people might say it's not twice as much work, but it's also that I imagine if one of them wakes up, the other one wakes up. Because they're like, oh, you're crying. Why are you crying? I'm crying now. I can hear you crying, kind of thing, in almost solidarity, some sort of like, what's it called, protest together, and then trying to go back into work the next day and then also deal with that intensity just comes at like a real energetic cost.
Yeah, totally. It's exactly right. It's a great way of describing it. And you know, that is the difference. There are only so many hours you can work in a day, and I've worked less than 50, and I've worked a lot more. And the reality is, the intensity is the thing that kills you. It's not the hours. You can always fit more hours in, and you know, as you know, as a business owner, when you enjoy what you're doing, you're passionate about it, and you almost overwork too much for good reasons because you're enjoying it. But you know, and there was elements of that with that project. I was enjoying it. I was learning. It was all good stuff, but the intensity was high. It was something new to me. My team needed me. And it required a lot from me, not because they were bad, just because it was a tough project for them too. And likewise across the business. So yeah, it's one of those things. And like I said, every one of the things, having spoken to quite a few men, but parents in general, more men, but parents in general, the one thing that comes across is regrets, right? It's just like, and especially for men, I wish I'd spent more time with my kids. I think that's subtly changing. It's the gender roles are redefining themselves, but it's going way too slowly. And, you know, you said at the beginning about like the way that men approach pregnancy, and they're like, oh, it's come out now. And like, I better start getting involved. And like, I just think all parents, and it's one of the reasons I don't focus specifically on men. It's like, we all need to think about who we want to be as a parent, because whether you like it or not, your kids are going to take so much away from you. In a weird way, it doesn't matter. Total time spent with them matters a bit, but it doesn't matter as much about the quality of the time when they're with you. Because, you know, there are practical realities around. People do have to work. People have other commitments, whatever it is. So, you know, you're not going to be able to spend 24/7 with your kids, which they would take if you could. But what does matter is how you are when you're with them. And, you know, that isn't something that just happens. They don't pop out and you're like, oh, I'm a dad now, or I'm a mum. Like, I'll just switch on mum mode, dad mode, and it's just going to work and happen. It's like, oh, no, I've got all these things that I've learned, you know, the baggage that I brought with me through my life, the positive things that I've developed through my life. And like, are they going to serve me now as a parent? Like, are they going to make me have the impact that I want on my kids? Am I going to be the dad or the mum that I want to be? You know, there's a load of practical stuff that goes with that doesn't give you a lot of time to think about that. You know, meantime, you're trying to figure out how to find childcare. You know, who's going to look after them? How are you going to make the finances go around? You know, how you're going to have some time for yourself so you don't go absolutely batshit crazy. You know, all these things kind of play into each other.
And it's so true, you know, because I look back and think, you know, both my parents are from Jamaica, and I can imagine that neither of them even thought to themselves, like, what sort of parent do I want to be? What are the things that I don't want to pass on to my children? You know, like I was kind of smiling as I'm saying this because I could imagine like my dad probably became a father, not to me. I've got a sister who's older, and I reckon he was probably very early 20s, very, very early 20s. It wasn't a child by choice, so we say, not by his choice. So there would have been no thought from his side, right, about these sorts of questions about, you know, as you said, like, what sort of parent do I want to be? I want to change track a bit, right? Because there's something you've mentioned, there's something that, you know, we've talked a bit about, is that there was a journey for you, right? As you said, there's a 4-year journey for you of of IVF. And this is, I know from, some conversations that we've had and some conversations I've had other people, this is a really tough journey. Right? I've never spoken to anybody who talked about IVF and was like, yeah, no, it wasn't too bad. I've never heard anyone say it to me. And I spent a week on a retreat, actually. I spent a week with a woman and she'd been through IVF and we talked about it a few times as well. But even less so is you don't really hear men talking about the side of it and the effects that it has on oneself, one's relationship. So I'm really interested, Frank, from your point of view, like, I guess I'm also interested at the kind of starting point, at the point that you realize the two of you, you and Laura, like, okay, we're going to have to go down this route. This is a route we're going to have to go down. And the journey along the way, kind of emotionally for yourself, of Laura, the effects it had on you, like, what was that like for you, or for you and Laura?
Yeah. And it was hard. Definitely. And it was harder for Laura. There are things, pregnancy and IVF, obviously have much greater physical impact on the wife in the situation, or the person that's bearing the child. But, for me, I mean, by that point, we were living a pretty healthy lifestyle. We lived at that point in Somerset in a very kind of quiet, almost like a retirement village, just because of where I was working at the time. So we were out of the city, kind of a lot of the things that might have distracted us and caused us, coming from a kind of, we weren't going out drinking a lot or anything like that. Not that I think we would have done by that age, but, so there was, we already felt like we were in lockdown. And I think weirdly that almost made it harder, because what happened over those years is the main thing about IVF is certainly for us anyway, you just start second guessing everything. Because, I think some people have known issues with why they can't get pregnant. We didn't. And that's quite common. And so you don't know if it's the man, you don't know if it's the woman. My sperm was a bit ropey. When we had it tested, it was a bit all over the place, which you probably, you can understand from my previous lifestyle choices. But it wasn't so bad that they were like, look, this stuff needs to go in the bin, right? So, which was great. It was, and so you start second guessing everything. And so the first thing that happened is, like, Laura came off all alcohol. We should like look through all her products, look through everything. We're just Googling everything and like, what could possibly be having an adverse effect on fertility from her perspective. And this was pre-IVF. This was like while we were just trying, and we just realized it was taking us longer. Because I guess of that 4 years, the IVF was probably about 2.5. So I think we had about 18 months where we were trying and just nothing was happening, obviously. And we were in our late 30s at that point. So that's kind of the danger zone for pregnancy, is where your fertility rate starts to drop off. And I shouldn't use numbers because I can't remember what they are, but it's something like between, say, 35 and 40, your chances of conceiving drop off by 50, maybe even 80%, something like that. So it's huge. It's like a huge trough. And so, we were really just trying to make sure that she was in as good shape as possible to conceive. We're, obviously doing what we needed to do when we needed to do it and all that kind of stuff. Which, and that's another thing, I don't know about, in the other work that you do around sexuality and stuff, but I assume having an alarm clock set, for when it needs to happen is not something that you would necessarily advise for increasing levels of enjoyment in sex, right? So, no matter what your situation is, who else is around, whether you've just had a massive flaming argument or not, it doesn't matter, right? So that is not conducive in and of itself, and creates a lot of stress around sex, right? So there's kind of that element. And then gradually, as it became clear that we're going to need to go down the IVF route, I lived a pretty healthy lifestyle at that point, but I again cut out alcohol completely, just cut out anything that we thought, looked at our diet. And again, it was probably a slightly smaller leap for me because I was eating pretty healthily at that point anyway. But then you're like looking at your activities. So it's like, well, what are we doing? What are we spending our time doing? Like, how do we reduce stress? Like, go have acupuncture, do yoga, pregnancy, IVF, acupuncture, IVF yoga. And you just start doing all this stuff and it starts to take over your life. And so it's like, it's not a huge time commitment, but trying to get pregnant starts to become the thing that you think about all the time. And that in itself is not helpful, because actually you're trying to reduce stress levels. You're trying to still enjoy the process and being a couple and having another life. And the reality is it just becomes the focus. And, we really wanted kids, but I don't think either of us were like, if we don't have kids, our life is over. And I know there are some people who are like, more on that spectrum, who really, 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 really want kids more than anything in the world. And it's really hard to describe how difficult that is. And then you struggle to speak to other people about it, because it's kind of awkward for them, because what do they really say, right? They're kind of, well, best of luck. And then some people are like, oh, well, if it doesn't happen. And then some people are like, oh, well, I've had a mate who went through like 17 rounds of IVF and eventually got pregnant. Or, oh, I had a mate who went through 17 rounds of IVF and didn't get pregnant. And it's like, it's hard. You're trying to manage your emotions. And that, it had an impact on me and Laura's relationship, without a doubt. And, we have a super strong relationship. So it wasn't terminal or anything even close, but it definitely made the day-to-day a struggle. So yeah, it's a draining experience, and it can take over your life, and understandably so, because it is important, no matter what you think. It's a huge, if you do decide you want to have kids, then it's something that's important to you, right? So yes, that's kind of my experience of it. And then we got into the actual treatment itself. So that's almost like pre-IVF. And then you get to the treatment. Well, it's expensive. You get a certain number of rounds on the NHS, but actually it depends on where you live. So we got one because of where we lived at the time. Other people in, I think Camden does 3. So there's already a bit of kind of unfairness there. But ultimately, it's like, okay, fine, we'll take what we can get. And you go through the process, and then all of a sudden, Laura's having medication. She has to go through these procedures to get the eggs and put them back in, and all that kind of stuff. I have to contribute as well. And that requires you to come out of work. You also, it like quadruples the pressure of trying to be stress-free and be clean and everything else, because now all of a sudden, like, there's actual medical treatment involved, and potentially money on the table later on as well, and you're gonna have to find if you don't have it, if you want to continue. And so we went through 2 or 3 rounds of that. Eventually had got a good number of eggs out of Laura, and then eventually put them back in, and we got the twins. But yeah, it took over our lives, I think, on reflection. And it's hard to explain. It's so weird that something that is so, it's not a lot of time. It's exactly like you said before about the work, right? It's intense. It's very intense, and it kind of takes over what you're thinking about and starts to make you question every decision you make. Versus it really has taken over a lot of time in your life. And it's tough. So it's tough.
Wow. That's, yeah. It's, the first thing I've kind of put down there actually was like, you talked about sex and the alarm clock, and that is something that a number of men that I've spoken to, our mutual friend, I remember him talking to me about the alarm clock once actually. And I've got a client now as well, and speaking to him, he's just like, he gets like calendar updates of ovulation from his partner, He's like, it's ovulation days now. We create a whole plan for him, basically leading up, like, how do you need to show up, and what do you need to do with yourself, your own body together to create the energy of, in the ovulation period. And that's something that's like, most people really get uncomfortable with the idea of scheduled sex, right? It's one of the recommendations I make for people with sex intimacy isn't as frequent as you would like, is scheduling it, because, like all important things, we schedule it. Like you said, with the alarm clock, it's like, it's important. Yeah. You put it in the diary and you make it happen. But I think the overriding thing was like this, there's a stress that you're trying to get rid of, but trying to get rid of it creates more of the stress, right? Because it's like, you're like, okay, this thing's really important. Like, where is it? What's happening? What are we doing? What are we doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? What's happening here? You start looking at all the bits and pieces of your life. And that's, not many people have to go to that kind of fine detail of like, I kind of had this vision, and this might not be at all what happened, like sitting down and going through all your shampoo and like Googling all the ingredients on shampoo and being like, oh, it could be that shampoo's in the bin now. And then you're down to like, okay, our conditioner is just avocado and cream because, we've made it. We know it feels safe, type of thing. And not even to kind of laugh, but it's like, okay, because you start to like filter through everything in your life and go, okay, I want to get rid of all these toxins and all these things that could be affecting us negatively. And it's like you said, it becomes all consuming all your actions. And also, I'm adding into this, you've got to go to work and be at work and be a man at work, right? Who's running things and leading teams. And I'm imagining that, and it might be different from you, but for a lot of men, it's like they go to work and they don't really have much space to go, I'm going through this situation, this trying to have a child, going through IVF. I walk in the door, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling anxious, all this stuff's going on, and then walking through the door and then having to just kind of shut that all off and pretend to be the good boss.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, it's difficult because obviously people are sympathetic. Like, no, it's like, oh, but it is awkward. They don't know what to say. And like, we can have a laugh about all this stuff and, the alarm clock and they're going through all your stuff to find out whether it's safe or not. But that's not great workplace chat, particularly with the majority, 90% of the people that you're friends with at work, unless they're your really close circle. So, it's hard. And, you're trying to minimize stress at work as well, but then you don't get to control that, right? And you also, and it's much like parenting. You have an element of guilt that you're like, I've got this thing going on in my personal life, and is it impacting my work? And should it be? Because other people aren't having to go through this. So, how do I manage that so it's not impact other people, like you say, especially when you're in leadership positions? But I'm sure it's the same regardless.
Mm-hmm. And our interest, the thing that come to me there is like, I imagine there's a lot of support for women going through IVF. I imagine there's groups and there's I'm imagining this to be true. Was that your experience?
Yeah, it's tough. I'm not sure there are, to be honest. There might be. I don't think we particularly hooked up with any of them. And again, I think part of that was because we were halfway through this treatment, which also complicated things. We moved halfway across the country and all kinds of other stuff. So there was an element of a lot of stuff wasn't worth doing in phase one because we knew we were going to be leaving by the time we were further on the journey. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there's definitely, but I guess I'm lucky. I have friends like yourself. We have a open relationship. We have that kind of friend group, and all my friends are the same. So I wouldn't feel necessarily bashful or embarrassed about talking about it with them. But the problem is, as men, we just want to solve the problem, right? And there isn't a way to solve the problem. And so, there's definitely a need for a safe space for people to just talk about this stuff without a doubt.
And I imagine for a lot of men, it's like it can be quite, they can feel almost quite emasculated at the idea of like not being able to, have a child, and that the kind of concern about one's own sperm. And it starts to have that effect, but then it also creates that shame that would stop them from talking to their friends about the journey they're going through. I think of a friend of mine who I worked with for a lot of years, and it was only after quite a long period that he kind of one day just I remember walking through Holborn, and he was just like, him and his wife have been through multiple rounds of IVF, and they're like, he was just like, I haven't talked to anybody about this, and this is how I'm feeling. And I just was like, for the first thing I said to him was like, slow down and then keep talking, because we could just sit here, it's fine. But he's just like, shit, I hadn't talked to anybody about this. And, as I said, like, I guess for a lot of men, they don't have the support structures in place to be like, I'm going through IVF with my partner. I'm struggling, she's struggling, but I don't have anyone to go to because they don't have necessarily the friendship structures and so forth to get the support they need and just to be kind of heard and listened to.
Yeah, 100%. And, even where I think it's some of our mutual friends, interestingly, like there's like an acknowledgement they're going through it, but it's like they don't want to talk about it because they're like, as you say, it's like, there's some, and I even reflecting back on myself and Laura, there was never any blame, but you're definitely wondering like what the problem is, like, because you want to solve it, not, like I said, not coming from a place of blame, but that isn't a good energy. Like trying to like sniff around each other looking for the problem, right? It's not a good energy to have, especially when you're under this stress anyway, and you're both invested in the problem and trying to solve it. And I didn't talk about it too much, but obviously, you have the IVF, you have your sex, whatever it is, and then you're testing. Like that's such a loaded moment. You fail so well. We did, certainly. You fail, and most people will on this journey fail so many more times than did pass. And so when you fail, you've got that to process, especially when you start on the IVF track, and especially if you're paying, because there's a lot of time, energy, money, significance in that moment. And then you're like, right, on to the next one. And, you know, your wife's got to go through another freaking procedure. You know that, you know, you're going to have to carry on in this kind of stoic lifestyle. And that by that point, that's like the least of your worries, but it's all it is. It's like I said, it takes over your life, I think.
And it's that, there's a kind of like peak, isn't it? You know, it's like building up. And then there's the test comes, you know, it's like we're testing.
Yeah.
And then it's like, it's not gone the way you want it to. And then there's a massive emotional kind of crash at this point, because the hope builds and there's a massive emotional crash. And the two of you are having to hold each other in that moment of that emotional kind of crash.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're, you know, at times that's kind of the last thing that you want to be doing, because you have your own problems. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
So if you're enjoying this episode, this story, a very much a rags to riches story, someone coming from a council estate, becoming C-suite, and then really transforming their life through the kind of vehicle of actually becoming a parent and becoming more conscious and aware, and helping other parents become more conscious and aware, please do share this with someone who this will be beneficial for. Because when we share in this way, we allow other people to grow and gain knowledge and so forth. And it really is my mission to really be touching as many men in particular with this message of really knowing that they're not alone in what they're struggling with. Thank you for sharing, man. Because like I said, it's one of those things that I see is just not talked about very much amongst men, like the difficulties and what it feels like, and even the effect that it has on us personally as men, you know, of
yeah. And
I imagine a lot of men just kind of push it away and just kind of like leave their, and also be quite neglectful of partners. Like I know it's definitely not something that you would do, but I imagine there's a lot of men out there who are neglectful of their partners. And I imagine there's a lot of women who become neglectful of their men because they get so in their own experience. Because it's very easy for us to get so in our own experience of what's going on to forget that someone else, our partner, is also having an emotional experience and can leave us to feel almost like lonely or isolated within the relationship.
Yeah, 100%. There are definitely times when, you know, I think about the kind of the fights or the disagreements. We don't really fight, but the disagreements that we had during the time. And they do come from that space, I think, of just like us both needing something from the other and the other not being in the right place to be able to provide that. And, you know, it's hard because it's unfortunately, it's also a great preview for the experience of parenting, because you're both on this journey together, and kind of the universe doesn't really give a shit how resourceful you're feeling on that day or how much sleep you've had or whatever else. You know, you have to deal with what you have to deal with. So yeah, 100%.
And then you had the joyful experience of the twins coming along. I remember hearing about it. And just being so happy, you know, because I know we had seen each other before our mutual friend went off to live outside the country. And I can't remember exactly when I heard. I feel like it might have been through WhatsApp, and just being like so fucking overjoyed. I remember going into Terminal also, and she was like, I don't remember meeting Frank. I was like, okay. She was like, there was a lot of people there that night. And I was like, okay. And then, you know, the two of them come along, and, you know, we talked about how the career path shifted, and now the work that you're doing is with parents, right? And, you know, we touched on this a little bit, but I want to touch a little bit about people being unprepared. And I'm going to start with men first, because, you know, I like to focus on men. It's like, why is it that you think that men are so often so unprepared for fatherhood?
Yeah, I mean, you know, toxic masculinity is probably the answer, but it's a bit of a broad brush throwaway comment, right? But to make that more specific, not many of us have great male role models. So of our age group, and I don't know, I guess we are getting on a bit now, right? So if you talk to a 25-year-old, maybe they'll give you a slightly different answer, because I think things probably have shifted even over that period. But certainly for people our age, so call it 40, we'll round down. Then I think, you know, our parents weren't that involved, and hands off, I think, is like, let the woman deal with it. And there's some practical stuff there. men, rightly or wrongly, were breadwinners for a long time. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying that's the right answer. Clearly, we're moving on to something a bit more equitable now in the world, and that's great. I think to give women the equal opportunity wherever we can. But the reality is, at the same time, at that time, that was the model. And so without beating anyone up about it, that men felt like they were going out and doing their job in earning money, everything else, meanwhile leaving women with kids. And the reality is, looking after kids is a million times harder than any job. I can tell you that for free. So, and men didn't understand that. And so I think there's an element of, we learned that hands-off behavior. The fact that just parenting is like, the advice I got as a parent, and this wasn't just for men, but probably typically was you're not going to be able to go to the pub as much, and you're going to be tired. And like, both of those things are true, but they're also utterly fucking useless at helping anyone prepare for being a parent, right? And I feel like it's a great kind of, that is really indicative of how we think about parenting. It's like, it's this thing that happens, your lifestyle changes a bit, and then you just get through it. And like, I don't want to just get through parenting. We shouldn't be wanting to get through parenting for our kids. We should be wanting to make it an amazing experience for everyone, like for us as parents and also for our kids. But there is this like, and again, I don't know if this is, I don't think women think about it like this, but I could be wrong. But I think there is this kind of men's mindset of like, I'll be the dad and we'll get through it. And I want to be, I'm not saying I don't want to be a good dad, but I'm just saying the depth of thought is not there to articulate what does being a good dad mean. Like, I'll show up and, probably, I won't be angry. I'll be patient. Like, there's some things you can throw out there that people want to do, but that doesn't mean they're prepared for doing it. And I think the biggest piece of work in this, I think, applies to both men and women, is looking at yourself and going, if I know I want to be patient, if I know I want to build their self-esteem and self-confidence, if I know that requires me to give them the space to learn and fail, right? If I want to make sure that they feel loved and that they don't feel threatened and they feel safe and secure, like if I want to do all of those things, and maybe I've got another level of detail that sits below that says for me to do that. I mean, being patient is easy enough. Like, I'm just going to wait for them. I'm going to make sure there's space and time for them to learn slowly and do things at their own pace, especially when they're younger and they're learning, because that's good for them. They learn all kinds of things from having the space to do that and you not doing it for them. But what does that mean? Like, are you really set up to do that? Are you really set up to be a patient parent? I knew I wasn't. I was super impatient anyway. When you've had no sleep, your kids are screaming at you and just like doing the opposite of everything that you're trying to get them or asking them to do. You've got to get to work. You've got other commitments. Your wife's still in bed or your husband's still in bed because they were on duty last night and got no sleep. You've got no support. You've got no one to talk to. And you just got to get this thing done and get everyone out the door. Like, are you going to be patient? Like, what's it going to take for you to be patient in that situation, right? Like Jesus to turn up, basically, and give you a hand. I don't know. So that's what it feels like we need sometimes. So there is like the level of difficulty is not talked about, and therefore we underestimate the need for us to be prepared. And I don't just mean knowing what to do. I mean understanding how we as an individual are going to be able to do that. Because there are people out there who are like, I'm just a really laid back, patient person. And therefore, I'm not worried about being patient because I've dealt with stressful situations before when I've been sleep deprived and I don't get more impatient. If anything, I'm more relaxed and it's just like, great, you know yourself. That's not an area of focus for you. You may struggle with something else like getting them to nursery on time, right? I don't know. I just make it up. But, so when I talk about being unprepared, it is very focused on ourselves. And it is firstly about knowing who we want to be as parents and what good looks like. Because we don't get to think about it. We're just told to muddle through. And what the conversations I have with people are like, yeah, I eventually found balance and figured out how to make it all work. And then I kind of say, when did that happen? And they're usually like, when the kids were like 10, teenagers, maybe even when they left home. And I'm like, that's most of their childhood is gone. And in that time, we've just been literally trying to figure it out on the fly. So if I said to you, David, you're going to have this really new challenging role that I want you to take on, you're going to be looking after another human being who will literally die if you fuck it up on a daily basis. They will literally die. And it's going to be so impactful and meaningful to you that it's like going to be one of the most important things that you ever deliver. and you're not going to get any sleep, and all the things that you've learned to rely on to get you to make you a successful human being going to be tested because they may or may not be appropriate for now. Like, what do you need to be able to prepare for that? And what support are you going to need when you're in that role? You're going to give me a long list, I think, right?
Yeah.
And you're probably going to take some time out to do that. And that's really what parenting is. And yet the advice I get is like, you're not going to be able to go to the pub as much and you're going to be tired. And it's like, the advice I should have got is like, right, let me hear some stories about how it actually is. Now you go away and think about what that's going to mean for you. Like, I already knew I was a sleep princess, which basically means if I don't get sleep, I'm a horrific human being. And so I knew that when I was not getting sleep, thank God Laura's not the same, but I knew that when I was not going to be getting sleep, that it was going to be super important that I manage that. So again, it's just another thing I needed to know about myself. I needed to put things in place to try and mitigate. And, you know, I'm in danger of making it sound like this is a process that you go through and then you fix it and you're an amazing parent. Like that's definitely not it. But it's like minimizing regrets, minimizing guilt, minimizing feelings of failure. Like I just feel like we can do better if we put more effort into it. And the hard part is parents themselves are in the worst position to put more effort into it because by then you're in the mix. And so that doesn't mean you can't put effort into it then, but I think we just need to think about how we tee ourselves up for it, you know?
It's like, as I hear you speak, it's like, the first thing that kind of came to me was around this concept about men and parent and fatherhood is how we kind of push it away. And I'm using really examples of like the men in my family, particularly my father and some of the men that I'm friends with who kind of see it as a woman's role to do that, the nurturing, right? Because it's these feminine attributes of like nurturing and looking after and caring and all this stuff that we kind of just see as, oh, well, that's woman's work. That's what women's do. That's kind of the first problem that a lot of men, not all men, a lot of men kind of experience because they already see the parenting as a woman's role. So it's like their role is secondary or it becomes, you know, oh, I should just go to work and that's the only thing I do. But I also hear there is like parents are unprepared for parenting because they don't put enough thought into it. It's a little bit like, and this is not in any way in the same comparison, but it's something that I always say to people about dating, right? Online dating in particular. A lot of people will just literally open up an online dating app and go, okay, I'm going to do some online dating now. Rush and quickly and find 5 photos, think of a few things to write and then chuck it down and put it out there. Not thinking that what they've just done has the potential to help them find the person they will spend the rest of their life with, right? Instead of putting some thought to it and stopping and getting some support and, you know, the way that I sit with my clients and like we go through like, what do you enjoy? What's your life like? What are the things that you enjoy? What some of these photos say about who you are? And we put together this profile that resonates with them. So I'm hearing through what you're saying, it's like, actually to be the parent you want to be, I'm going to sneeze. No, it's gone. To be the parent you want to be, it's almost like you need to treat it in the same way you would, like you said, if you're taking on a new job, role, or business. If you were to buy a business or to start a business, you'd create a business plan. You'd want to do some forecasting and thinking about where you want to be and how what you want to look, what sort of attributes you need to bring, what sort of weaknesses that you have that maybe your business partner, your partner has, and be like, okay, all right, we're both really useless at financial planning. Okay, we need to get a course on financial planning, right? So that we know how to do that a bit better. Or maybe there's some things you need to shift around in your life. So like what I'm kind of getting from what you're saying is like the thought that goes into the kind of pre-parenting planning. That sounds like a wonderful course name, PPP, is to actually think about all these different attributes and bits and pieces, but also, as you said a number of times, which I think I really love because it's something I say to my clients a lot, is like, who do you want to be as a parent? What sort of parent do you want to show up as? And this bit I'm adding in is like, what do you need to start doing now so that when in the future time comes that you are that parent, not that you start thinking about that when the little baby's in your hand and you're like, I want to be really patient. And then 2 days later, they're screaming and crying and it's 4 a.m. and you've been up since, 12 at night and you haven't, and then you're trying to say, be a patient parent, but you can't, you've got no capacity for patience at this point because you're beyond your wit's end. But if we had done some thinking about this and created some structures and made some decisions and choices beforehand, we'd put ourselves in a much better position to be the parent that we want to be.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, I don't know. I think a lot of parents do think a lot about being a parent. I think it's just we're missing a level of the cake. We've got like the icing, which is like, what color are we going to paint the nursery?
Yeah.
Like, what's the house going? What pram are we going to buy? Like, all this stuff gets a lot of airtime, right? And rightly so. Some of those decisions are important, right? Your car seats, they could save their life, right? So I'm not trying to minimize any of this stuff. And then we have the next layer of the cake, which is like, okay, and me and Laura spent loads of time on this, which is what do you want to do with those kids? Like, what is your philosophy of bringing them up? So we have like respectful parenting. We kind of follow Montessori principles. So like, like I've said, patience, independence, creating space for them, all that stuff. All parents are going to want their kids to feel loved and supported, right? So that's like layer 2 of the cake. And then everyone stops because they're like, right, I know what to do. I've got to be patient. And they're like, and I know what pram I'm buying. I know what stroller I'm buying, so I can move them around. And then they stop. And the bit that's missing is like, how is all that going to hang together? And, I do work with parents who are already parents. And it's exactly what you said, is like, you have to take them out of where they're at and start to look back at, okay, that key question, what kind of parent do you want to be and what needs to change? Because they're then in it. So they've got, in a way, it's harder because they've got less time, they've got less energy, they've got more to deal with. But on the flip side, they've been through part of the experience. They will understand the urgency and the need for it. And, I said the program is all around presence. The reason it's presence is because you have to fix pretty much all of this stuff to be present. So in order to be present, you can't be feeling overwhelmed. You can't be feeling guilty. You can't be feeling judged. You have to be able to fix all that stuff. And that's why it's important. It's like, build out who you want to be. What's the goal look like? What does being an amazing parent feel like to you? What do you need to fix in order to be that person? And then, okay, expectations and priorities, like huge. We all have crazy expectations when it comes to parenting. And then we find out the reality is we can't live up to any of them. So we have to change our priorities to be able to meet them. We have to work on our resilience. So these are all the things that we tend to cover that then help, as you say, put that structure and framework in place, because the alternative is to literally just go from what will feel like, for most parents that I speak to at least, shit show to shit show, trying to figure it out on the fly. And yeah, over time it gets a little easier, and over time you build up resilience. Like, we went from, I spoke to you earlier about how things would change just as we thought we got our heads around it. Well, to begin with, that was horrific, and we'd kind of go and cry in a corner. But then after a few months, we kind of laughed about it. Right. So it does get better over time, but it's such a tough way of dealing with it. And of course, when you're under pressure, when you feel like things are hard, you're definitely not going to be bringing the best of yourself to your kids, right? And so it's almost like a downward spiral that can be created quite often for people.
And what are some of the kind of common issues that I'm going to call them pre-parents? I don't know if there's an official name, but what are some of the kind of common kind of problems that pre-parents are really unaware of, right? That kind of come when you start working with them. It's like, I'll just say the question again, is what are some of those common problems that pre-parents are kind of completely unaware of that are going to be affecting them they haven't come across yet?
Yeah, you know what? I think if I said the words overwhelm, guilt, regret, I think most people who are thinking about being parents would have heard those words in the context of parenting. But I think it's just the uncompromisingness of the situation that is, you would, I spoke to a friend of mine to begin with, and she was literally like, if someone told you what being a parent was like, no one would be a fucking parent. That's why no one tells you. And like, we laughed, but there's an element of truth to it, right? Because you would never, like, you'll get this. People kind of ask me, how tiring is it? And I'm like, well, if you imagine, we used to go out and, stay out all night, right? And so let's say we've been to a 2-day festival. Like, the bad nights are like the morning of the second day or the third day, right? So that you imagine you're then given a human being to look after who's totally dependent on you, and you need to get right or they will die, right? And you're handed that as you're walking out the gates of your festival, right? That's how it feels, right? And then but then the problem is, and again, this varies. So I'm playing a somewhat of the worst end of the scale. But again, everyone goes through these periods. So this isn't the whole experience of parenting. I don't want to frighten anyone off, but there are chunks of time where it feels like this. So then you go to like, okay, well, that's the bad days. The good days feel like, okay, you've gone home and had one night's sleep. And then you wake up the next day, same thing again, repeated. And you know that you could have the next night could be one of those two. You could either have a good night in inverted commas, or you could have a bad night. But you don't know until you've been to bed, because you don't know if they're going to sleep through. You don't know what kind of night they're going to be sick. You don't know what kind of day you're going to have. Like, it's going to be a stressful day and you're just going to be zonked out. So it's like this ongoing, lack of certainty and control is huge. There's a massive impact, because in our lives, for most people, you wouldn't set yourself up like that. There's a degree of control and certainty that you need, and that is just ripped away, and that's super hard to deal with. So I think that's probably like one of the biggest underlying contributors to what we call overwhelm and guilt and regret is this like lack of control, because then all of a sudden you're like, and then you've got your job is carrying on as if nothing has happened, but you can't perform the same ways that you did before. You have other commitments, you have to come and go different times, all this kind of stuff. And it just leads you to just feel like, how do I deal with this? Where do I go? What do I do?
Yeah. It's that uncertainty, because I guess for some people, they really want certainty all the time in life. And, human beings, we thrive on a certain balance of certainty and uncertainty. And it sounds like the uncertainty creates as much overwhelm as the actual overwhelm itself. If that makes sense?
100%. Yeah. And this is where it can get tough, because there is this kind of downward spiral element. And it's why it's so important to get support. And that is another thing I think people probably underestimate, is the feelings of isolation, because it's much like the IVF journey. It's like, who do you speak to? Your family will give you lots of opinions, but they'll also be judging you. For many people, it's fairly unhealthy, and it doesn't really hurt the relationship with your own family. But you kind of have no choice sometimes but to take that advice and take that help. It kind of magnifies any issues you have with your spouse or with other family a lot, because both the state that you're in terms of physically and mentally, but also just because of the significance to your kids. Like, you care so much about how things play out and what's happening to them and how they're looked after, and what people say about them and you, that it really magnifies things you might have brushed off previously. So that's another huge one. And I think we've talked about the other one a lot, which is just the impact of mindsets and your existing behaviors. So I'll give you a really good, clear story of that. And it's one of the things that made me decide, along with Laura's business and supporting her and wanting to be a great dad, it made me decide I probably need to think about my career a little bit differently. I was having a one-to-one with my boss. This was after I'd been back to work. Kids were about 4 months old. And she was saying, oh, look, you're going to start feeling guilty about being at work and not being with your kids. And she was like, when that happens, let's talk through it, let's figure it out. But she's generally being helpful. She's an amazing boss, and she's trying to be supportive. So I was like, okay, great, good point. Not feeling it at the moment, but I will definitely think about it more. And then I went downstairs and just sat down with the kids in the playroom, and they were just like rolling around. New babies felt like you're saying, like they weren't walking yet. We had this like lovely mat we were all sat on and just like sunk into, and they're having a great time. And I was like, I don't feel guilty when I'm working. I feel amazing when I'm working. I feel guilty when I'm with my kids and I'm not working. Like, even amongst this amazing moment of just chilling out with these while they were rolling around having fun. And that was the moment when it like snapped, and I was like, okay, I'm not willing to be a parent where my brain is wired with that priority set. And, given my career, given how much I prioritize that in my life, it totally makes sense, right? That I would put my career before everything else. But that wasn't a conscious decision. That was just the way my wiring was wired. And so it goes back to like understanding your mindsets, understanding your behaviors, understanding your priorities, and thinking about the impact that's going to have is huge. And that's an ongoing process, because those things change as well.
And that's an interesting one that you say there about feeling guilty about spending time with the little ones. And I imagine this is quite a common occurrence for a lot of parents. I'm going to, insert quite a lot of men, is that they're going to work, and because they're quote unquote a man, they need to feel that need to show up a certain way in the office. And if they're tired and so forth, people love to throw in little comments as well, like, about your work performance now that you've had a child and so forth. And I imagine then feeling that pressure of like needing to kind of turn it on even more. And then, like you said, you go downstairs and then you're rolling around on the mat and you're like, this feels really beautiful. But there's a part of your mind that's like, oh, I need to finish that paper. Actually, I need to remember to send that email to that person and all that. And, you had the kind of consciousness and awareness to go, wait a minute, this isn't how I want it to be. But there's a lot of men out there and parents who they think that, and they think that's just how it is.
Yeah, exactly. And it's dangerous. And I talk about a guilt spiral, right? So, whatever you're feeling guilty about, this is a parental thing. If you're at work, you're going to feel guilty about not being with your kids. If you're with your kids, you're going to feel guilty about not being at work. And so what you do is you throw more time and energy at your kids, but you're still feeling guilty. That time and energy potentially doesn't give you the reward that you want because you're still not present, because you're not there in the room with them. So they're not feeling, they're potentially playing up or reacting to that lack of presence, and they're not, and you're not feeling great about it because you still realize that you're feeling guilty, but you spend a load of money on a day out and this will take a load of time out. Meanwhile, at work, you're working harder and harder and harder. And then you start feeling guilty about feeling guilty. And then it's just like this endless cycle and downward spiral. And it's really hard to pull out of, because once you're in it, you're just like, well, what do I do to get? And the answer is you have to kind of set your expectations and your priorities so that you get rid of that guilt and you create some boundaries, so that when I'm with my kids, I'm with my kids, and you have to create a mechanism within yourself that enables you to do that. And again, that's kind of different for everyone. But as you say, that structure is so important and being able to think about that. But your point of like challenging the beliefs that you have about parenting is so important. Like maybe people are okay. Like they're okay with being the breadwinner and being at work and working their ass off and seeing their kids on the weekend. And I'm sure they're doing an amazing job. Like that's totally okay. But just be conscious about that, because the thing I hear, and again, especially from men, is when they're older, they have regrets that they didn't spend enough quality time with their kids when they were younger. And it's like, it's too late then. Regrets are the one thing that we can't unpick because it's already happened. So.
And it's the sort of conversation that, is so important to have before we have children, during the kind of pregnancy phase. Is like, like much of what you've said. It's like, how do we want to be? Because I'm just thinking of, I've worked with quite a few men that have said exactly what you're saying. When I was probably in my mid-20s, they were mid-40s. And, I asked them about having kids, and quite a few of them, they kind of were like, after a few pints, be like, I remember one guy saying to me, he's like, when you first have kids, he was like, make sure you don't just leave everything to your wife. That's the words he said to me. Just don't leave everything to your wife. He's like, I just did that because I thought that's the best thing for us, because she seemed better. She seemed more natural. And I did what I was best at, which was go to work and make money. And he was like, all that did was create resentment between the two of us. And it meant that his first two kids, he's like, we had almost zero relationship as babies for the first few years of their life, because he just spent all his time in the office. Because part of it for him was, when he was in the office, he didn't feel as guilty. When he went home and he saw them, the guilt came on for him. He felt the guilt of like, oh my God, I don't really know you. You don't feel bonded with me. And to alleviate that guilt, he removed himself and worked even more.
Yeah. And that's that guilt spiral, right? You're doubling down on all the things that aren't fucking helping. Right. And it just creates more space, more gap, more guilt, ironically. So yeah, absolutely. And that's why that intentionality is so important. It's like because you have to think about your relationship with your spouse as well. It comes under huge pressure. Like, again, can't think of many, if any parents I've spoken to that haven't at some point had, some form of, wobble with their spouse, just trying to look after kids and get through the day. It's so common. So that intentionality around what you want and then not having that resentment there is huge. It's so important. But it's not just going to happen. And I think this is the key. It's another one of our key messages really, is like, if you're hoping that when kids arrive, you're just going to figure it out on your own, like, not many people do that. And if they do, it takes them a long time with a lot of collateral damage to everyone involved. And actually, I'm like, if you can do some thinking beforehand, and if you don't have the opportunity to do that, then fine, but get some help when they arrive. It doesn't have to be speaking to me, but just like, do some of the exercises, thinking about some of these questions that we've raised, go get a coach, psychiatrist, whatever, doesn't matter. But yeah, get that help, because that feeling of isolation, and that it's one of those other almost cultural expectations. Is like, well, if you're a good parent, you'll figure it out, because all families are different. And, you have to figure it out for yourself, because what's right for you and your family is what's right for you and your family. That's all true. And I think that's one of the reasons coaching is so helpful in this space, is because we're not delivering answers, we're helping you come to your own. But that doesn't mean you don't need help. Right? And that stretches beyond someone who can come and give you a day, which is super important. Like, you need childcare, you need people who can come and help you with the housework or whatever else it is that you need to do, support in your business, support with your team at work. You need all those things. I'm not in any way minimizing them, but it's treating the symptom, not the cause,
Yeah. It's pretty profound, because, our conversations really made me think, and they've made me have conversations with my partner also about just thinking about the future already, even if we're like, I don't know, a couple of years away potentially. It's like thinking about the things we're going to need. Like, how do we want it to be? As one of the questions, like, I'm like, where do we want to live? Do we want to be near family? Like, her family are in Sweden. So do we want to move to Sweden? Do we want to move back to London? Do we want to be near my parents? Like, do we think we could, do this and be far away from people without support? And, what sort of support do we want? Like, all these sorts of questions are, big questions we're asking ourselves now, which I imagine a lot of parents they're just not even thinking. There's an assumption. I think a lot of us, and, we've gone over this many times, but I feel to say again, it's like we just unconsciously cookie cut from what we were given, because there's an element of, and I've heard this with plenty of people, and it comes up in many different situations I see now, especially when we talk about trauma, or we talk about childhood and stuff like that. It's like, well, I'm all right. So, it's totally fine to do what I got, actually. And we are all right. We are all right. But like, we want more than just all right. I want my kids to be a bit more than just all right in my opinion. That's like kind of how I'm seeing it.
Yeah, 100%. I think we all want to leave the world a better place than we left it. And if there isn't, in Jesus Christ, whether you like it or not, your kids are going to learn from you and take so much away from you. So kind of whether you like it or not. And like, back to your example of that father who doesn't see things because he feels guilty. Like, that's going to have such a profound effect on them. And I'm not knocking him for doing that. Like, this is a hard process. No one should be judged. But I'm just saying factually that will have an impact on them. Like, whether you like it or not, that's what they're going to learn, whether you're there or not. So you do have to think about that. And I think, your point around where you're going to live, what you're going to do is super important. I think just the magnitude of the challenge is underplayed, because you just won't be able to go to the pub as much, David. Like, if that's what you're basing your decisions about where you're going to live, then that's not going to fucking help you. I can tell you now, right? And that's not how it plays out for most people. And there are people who I'm sure have amazing parenting experiences. They sail through it. Everything's just sort of works itself out. But they're not most people from what I hear and see.
No, nor from what I hear and see actually as well. When I talk to people about parenting, and I've kind of gone out of my way, especially in the last year, to talk to men about parenting. And the one thing almost all of them say is a different range of spectrum is how unprepared they felt. Some did a lot of research, like yourselves, like you sent me a ton of like podcasts and book recommendations and stuff like that. And there's that side. And then there's also the parents who are like, oh my God, I didn't really feel prepared at all. And I didn't think about this at all. Oh shit. And I feel like I'm literally like racing an F1 car and trying to learn how the controls work as we're taking corners.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what it feels like. And I'm not sure, and I guess this is really, again, my key point is like, it's probably always going to feel a bit like that. Like, we can definitely do more preparation that will help us with that. Like, the work that me and Laura did to align around how we wanted to, the way we wanted to parent. So like this Montessori parenting style was huge in terms of stopping us from falling out with each other. Because we never really had to debate when a situation occurred with the kids. We didn't have to debate how we were going to respond. We both knew, that, and even if we got it wrong, like, we could see where the other person was coming from, and maybe we'd talk about it afterwards and say, oh, should we have done it like that? Maybe whatever. Like, it's just, it made it. But the point is, it didn't help me do it in the moment. It helped me know what I should be doing, but it didn't give me the resources that I needed to be able to do it in the moment, because you're driving an F1 car, right? And if you haven't thought about taking driving lessons, the fact that you know that you need to use the steering wheel and the pedals doesn't help you actually drive an F1 car when you're doing 180 miles an hour through a chicane, right? So that's that additional level of just like the knowing of the experience, the understanding of yourself, and how you're gonna play into that is so huge.
Beautiful. And before we finish up, I was thinking actually, it's like, if you were to kind of go back again, right? You know, if you were going to talk to Frank 3 years ago, is there any kind of nuggets of advice or guidance you would give him?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few actually. Like, you know, we talked about those questions around what kind of parent you want to be in. Me and Laura spoke a lot about those. We didn't really think, as evidenced by our maternity leave kind of fuck up, basically. We really think about what experience we wanted to have. So as a couple and as individuals, so we're like, right, our kids are going to have this amazing experience of parenting. I mean, we're working on it, right? I'm not saying we're delivering it, 100%, but we're working on it. And we thought about, to a certain extent, what help we'd need. Again, we undercooked it because I was operating out of space. So if you just won't be able to go to the pub as much. And I suspected that was wrong. It felt deeply wrong. And that was the best advice someone could give me. But what do you do, right? You couldn't get it. I couldn't get anything more concrete. And so, definitely focusing on what experience you want. Like, it's okay to be a little bit selfish about it, because you know what, if you don't get what you need, you're not going to be able to show up as the best version of yourself for your kids. So, you know, you can't, I spoke to you at the beginning, before we start this call, I have no recreational life at the moment. I literally have nothing. I maybe get an hour of Netflix a week, something like that. But you know what? I really love what I'm doing for work. So that fills that gap for me. If I was doing some of the jobs I've done in my past, not my last one probably, but some of the jobs when I was, further down my career where I didn't really enjoy them that much, I would need something else to plug that gap, right? So you just have to be aware of yourself. So I think that's one. I think the other thing is just focusing on yourself, like who you're going to be. That's the biggest advice. I didn't do enough of it. And I've had to figure this stuff all out while driving the F1 car. And it would have been nice to just have these things front and center in mind as I went into it. I should have known I was a workaholic, and that would probably mean that I was going to feel guilty when I was with my kids and not work. Like, I could have been a bit more cognizant of that, I think. And there's probably many things like that I could have been aware of. Doesn't mean you can fix them straight away, but it just means you're consciously incompetent instead of unconsciously incompetent. And then you end up 10, 15 years later with regrets. So.
Yeah, and those are wonderful nuggets for the listeners, the potential pre-parents, potential parents, post-birth parents. I don't know if I imagine there's terms for all those different stages that are there, but I don't currently know them. Listeners, if you know those terms, please send me an email to update me and do my best with terms. Because it's not that hard to remember stuff, actually, as well. It's and it's also really, really important. Frank, man, this has been phenomenal. I'm going to send this podcast to Orsa for her to listen to as well, and we'll probably spark a lot of conversation for us, actually, that we need to have in the next kind of coming probably 6 to 12 months or so. Actually, to be honest, these sorts of conversations will be happening.
Brilliant.
But yeah, I think that we'll probably wrap it up there, because we've been going a fair way. If the listeners wanted to get in contact with you, now, where's kind of the best place to kind of find you? I know you're an active man on LinkedIn, definitely. Yeah.
LinkedIn's the primary channel at the moment. Instagram and Facebook will be coming very, very shortly. But you can find me on LinkedIn, Ranjit Patel. It's Present Parent Program is written under my name. So you'll be able to see straight away that it's me. And then I have two websites. One is the presentparentprogram.com, which is the coaching program, and you can find details of all that there. But actually, if you're just generally more interested in kind of parenting, I have a blog about looking after the twins that ranges from some of the stuff we've talked about my journey, so like my self-improvement journey, if you like, through all of this, but also practical stuff, like how do we get twins down to bed at night? How do we deal with sleep and stuff? So that is twincident.blog. And there's a newsletter you can sign up to there as well, which will give you the launch of Facebook and Instagram when it goes live, along with the regular newsletters about just general chaos of parenting.
And I can definitely recommend, I'll put all that stuff, all the links will be down in the show notes, listeners. I can definitely recommend the blog. I've had a good read of the blog, and some of the pictures are wonderful as well. Seeing the twins happily playing. Frank, like, spilled out in places sometimes as well. But yeah, listeners, thank you for listening. I'm sure we'd both love to hear what you learned from this, because I imagine, especially if you're not quite parents yet, there was a whole load of stuff that you've just heard and you're like, fuck me, that's a lot to take on. So please reach out actually with any questions or any support, even if it's just to get some clarity on something to me or to Ranjit or Frank, depending, because I'm sure it's going to be super useful for you, because as we've kind of seen here, it's like the level of support can feel like it's not really there for us as men. And actually, you know, Frank's been through it in a way that's very unique, in the double way, you know, in the way that most people haven't. So his knowledge and expertise is been sharpened by that experience massively. But listeners, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frank. And we'll be back with another episode.